Okay, I think we can get started. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to anyone joining us today. My name is Alan Dominguez, and on behalf of the International Dysphagia Diet Standardization Initiative, or IDDSI, I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar titled Modified Texture Use in Long-Term Care, Issues and Implications, presented by Dr. Heather Keller. We would like to thank our very generous sponsors who allow the work of IDDSI to continue and who support implementation around the world. Now, before we begin, I just want to go through some quick housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded. The participants joining us today are in listen-only mode, which means that the panelists will not hear or see you, and that your microphone and video will remain off for the session. However, if you have any questions, please submit them throughout the presentation using the questions tab or your button in your control panel of the GoToWebinar platform. Our panelists will address these questions at the end of the presentation, when we will have about 20 minutes for a Q&A period. Now, IDDSI doesn't currently offer continuing education units, but you will receive a certificate of attendance shortly after the end of this webinar. I think that's it for housekeeping. So now, moving on to our wonderful panelists for today. Dr. Heather Keller is a professor and research chair in nutrition and aging at the Schlegel Research Institute for Aging and the Department of Kinesiology and Health Sciences at the University of Waterloo in Canada. Dr. Keller's research is focused on improving the health and quality of life of older adults throughout food and nutrition. Her research is practice-focused with knowledge translation and implementation science components. So, Dr. Keller, we are so thrilled to have you. Welcome, and please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Alan. So it's a real pleasure to be with you today to talk about one of my passions, which is food in long-term care. And I'll be presenting some recent results that, well, recent-ish, but you'll see the power of the results and how important they are for thinking about modified texture foods in long-term care. Before I begin, though, I'd like to just start with the land acknowledgement that we do in Canada. So I acknowledge that I live, work, and play on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples situated on the Hodman Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. So I welcome those of you that are elsewhere to also make your land acknowledgement at this time. I just also like to disclose some of my interests in terms of work that I've done. I have various speaker honoraria, educational research matching funding for a few years with some hospital work that I've done with Nutrition. My research funding, as you can see there, a variety of organizations. I'm an endowed research chair, as already noted, and I'm also a board member of some key groups, the Canadian Malnutrition Task Force and the Research Institute for Aging. But there are no commercial interests in this presentation today. So learning objectives, describe the making the most of mealtime study, first off, then provide an overview of the prevalence study that was based on this concept to try to understand the impacts of various factors that could lead to poor food intake in long-term care. Specifically outline what we've learned about modified texture food and fluid, and consider how modified texture food and fluid can be improved in this setting. And then moving forward, what we should be thinking about with dysphagia and modified texture foods in this sector. So why does poor food intake occur in long-term care? Well, for a long time, we've thought it was several things, and I'll talk about the M3 concept in a little bit more detail, but it can be a poor or mismatched food product, a deficient eating environment, so thinking about a chaotic dining environment, or even a very quiet one that doesn't lead to social engagement for older adults and interest then in eating, or inability to access and consume food. And this is sort of where dysphagia fits in, chewing and swallowing problems, inability to feed oneself. All of these factors can lead to inadequate food intake. However, they're extremely complex when we think about the long-term care sector. And so making the most of Mealtimes concept was developed by myself and a group of researchers across Canada who had interest in long-term care. We knew that food intake should be our focus rather than malnutrition, because in this setting, malnutrition is eventual at the end of life for many individuals. So that should not be the target, but rather supporting food intake for not only nutrition and health, but also quality of life. So the M3 stands for meal quality, meal access, and mealtime experience. And it picks up on that prior slide, the three key areas we think are drivers for poor food intake in long-term care. So building out that a little bit more, meal quality would be things like sensory appeal and nutrient density, variety, preference, etc. Meal access would be things like the taste and smell of the individual, their capacity, food availability in the home between meals especially, texture meeting their needs, which is what we'll be talking about today, of course, and swallowing problems. The mealtime experience picks up on sort of those social and psychological as well as physical environment around the person that can impact their food intake. So you think about, for example, the ambiance in the dining room, social interactions that can or don't happen, meal pace as someone is being assisted, or even if they're feeding themselves or they're feeling rushed during the meal time. These three areas we think lead to poor food intake, but they're obviously impacted by resident, staff, home, and policy or government levels. So let's take the outside circle for the first part. If you think about, again, in Canada, every province has their own legislation and funding for long-term care or residential care, and that funding includes how much they're willing to pay for food. That obviously then is affecting the food product. Think about staffing levels, size of homes that are legislated, etc. All of that policy level that can impact the care. At the home level, it could be things like the menu planning, how much effort is put into menu planning, how much time is allocated for that. Food sources, where they get their food. Food production and delivery processes, do they use a tray? Do they have restaurant style or bulk delivery at the table? The dining environment as well, the seating arrangements, the size of dining rooms, the furniture in those dining rooms, all of that can impact food intake, we believe. Staff, obviously, professional staff that are available to support, for example, speech language pathologist and dietitian, as well as the staffing ratios that support individuals for eating. How do they do training, for example, around dysphagia would be important to know. And do they, for example, require the staff that are at the table side to make thickened fluids versus the kitchen staff? And then the resident is also obviously important here. Does the person have dementia or depression? Do they have disability or functional challenges? Are there medications that are going to impact their food intake or salivation? Dentition, oral health, all of these can impact, obviously, food intake. So it's a very complex process. And at the time when we were planning the Making the Most of Meals Time study, all of these factors were suggested in the literature, but there hadn't been one study that tried to pull them all together in one sample to try to really tease out what was causing poor food intake in long-term care. And this is why the Making the Most of Mealtime prevalence study is so powerful. So M3 prevalence study, the aims were to measure food intake and compare it to requirements with the idea of asking, are residents eating enough? And to identify key modifiable drivers of food intake in long-term care that can be the basis for interventions to improve intake. This study was funded by the CIHR and obviously supported by the homes that were involved in the study. So just a little bit more about the study so you can understand some of the descriptive results and other results that I provide for you today. So we recruited 32 long-term care homes across Canada from 4 provinces, and we included 82 neighborhoods or units in those homes, and each home had to have at least one dementia care unit involved. This was important because, again, at the time when this study was being planned, about 5 or 6 years ago, more like 7 years ago now, I guess, dementia care units might have been totally missed because they couldn't work with the ethics around attaining consent and assent of residents to be involved. We selected randomly 20 residents from each of the homes within the areas or units that were involved, and you can see the eligibility criteria there. So again, it's not a convenient sample at the home level, but homes were certainly a convenient sample. And anyone who's done research in long-term care knows how hard it is to even gain access to a home to recruit individuals. So this was a key issue. Our dependent variable was 3-day food and fluid intake for each participant, which was observed and measured. So measured would be at the meal. We actually weighed every single piece of food that was on the main plate for an individual. If they had a side dish like a piece of bread or a pudding or those sorts of things that are side dishes or desserts, those we looked at the containers that were used in the home and measured a sample for the meal and used that as our guide. We estimated fluid intake by visual assessment. We collected data at the resident, staff, home, and provincial level, and we tried to access those areas of meal access, mealtime experience, and meal quality. And we actually have over 2,500 variables for each resident in this study. So it's a huge data set, which is now actually available as an open access data set. So key food related data collection that you should be aware of. We had 3 days, as I said, which was weighed and estimated. They were non-consecutive days. And again, this is the most rigorous way to collect data when we're doing weighed assessments. And we included 1 weekend day. We also did menu analysis for the first week of the menu for every home. Now, why you might say only the first week? Well, it's because some homes had 6 weeks of menu, some had 3. And so to do the whole menu would be 1, very labor intensive, and 2, challenges in terms of trying to analyze and understand because of the differences in menu planning. So we decided to use the first week only. We had looked at variety of the food that was offered from regular textures only, but we compared the menu as planned and as written out, and we all know those folks who work in long-term care, what ends up actually at the table might be slightly different than what's actually planned, but we did that for the regular and pureed consistencies. And we also looked at province and home variability in the menu planning and the quality of menus. So home characteristics. About 2/3 had the evening or supper meal as the largest meal of the day, which has challenges, as you know, for persons with dementia. Perhaps breakfast might be the better meal to be focusing in on. About 2/3 had what we call a decentralized kitchen and servery. So basically food would be prepared in a main kitchen and then brought up to the neighborhood or unit. Usually the kitchen's the basement, but not always, but brought to the neighborhood or unit. And then usually in a hot well, the food was held until plating happened at a servery, and it was delivered by restaurant style. So the resident would be asked what they wanted, and team members would take it to the food service worker, who would then put on the plate, and then we would deliver it to the resident. Over 2/3 had what we call traditional food preparation, which is meaning they made food in the home themselves. This is a bit different from acute care, where many institutions outsource the food production and delivery on trays. But in Canada, there's been a real push towards traditional food production. So a large portion of the food is actually prepared or at least assembled in the home. There was about 1/4 of commercial food products, though, being used. Things like frozen lasagna that might be very labor intensive to make were being purchased. Menu length on average was 3.8 weeks. The dollars spent on food, now remember this was 2014 to 2016-17, it was on average $7.70 a day, with the highest being in Ontario. So this is quite low. For people who might not be outside of Canada, in Ontario now it's $9.54, and other provinces are also moving up their food budget. The menu revision had happened in the last 6 months in 3/4 of the homes, but some had not. And in fact, some homes had up to 18 months they hadn't revised the menu. More than 2/3 are nonprofit, and this demonstrates a challenge in getting into homes, and this is certainly not consistent with some of the provinces that were involved. Ontario actually has more for-profit homes, and so it was a challenge of getting into that. So it's a convenient sample when it comes down to homes. About half had a registered dietitian at more than 0.5 FTE or full-time equivalent, and every home had a dietitian. Selected resident characteristics, we can see some common things that you would expect, just to orient folks who may not be as aware of this, this sector. INTERI is an assessment that's used within Canada in most provinces to track the needs of residents and their diagnoses. And the CPS 3+ means moderate to severe dementia. So 56% of our residents had moderate to severe dementia, which is consistent with the statistics that we have across Canada. Depression as diagnosed was 32%. Looking at the things we're interested in, thickened food about 11%. IDDSI 3 to 6 was 47%, but 4 to 5 was 32%, so the majority. We can see eating challenges. These were things we monitored by observation when doing the meal food intake record. We saw 2.4 eating challenges using a standardized tool called the EDFED. Eating assistance was required by 23%, partial was about 11%, and similar proportion needed total eating assistance. We had the benefit of having oral hygiene experts, hygienists going into each of these homes. They were trained to use a standardized examination for oral health, and irregular saliva was seen in 40% of folks, almost 50% when we asked the oral hygienist to rate if the person could have their food intake affected by the quality of their mouth, almost half. And urgent dental care, so broken and bleeding teeth that were abscessed, 9%. So that quite high. So oral health issues, hugely a big issue to address. Some more detail by the IDDSI level specifically. We can see here as you progress in terms of need for texture modification, which was the smallest percentage, so IDDSI 4 at 11%, you can see obviously the increased acuity or chronicity of the challenges that the persons are living with. So for example, again, CPS less than or equal to 2 means mild to no dementia. IDDSI 7, that was almost 60% of people, versus IDDSI 4, it was 7%. So those individuals obviously needing texture modification, more likely to have severe cognitive impairment, and also requiring assistance to eat, about 80%, and a low BMI. So you can see there's an accumulation of challenges happening when someone is also on texture modified levels that are more away from the regular texture. So are residents eating enough? And so if we look just at energy protein, so now this is consumption and not just what the menu said. So this is the actual food intake. Now you'll ask, how did we figure out IDDSI 3 to 5? We actually looked at the, we did it hypothetically. We didn't actually test out the foods. It was one, we couldn't get easily into the kitchens to do that testing, as you can imagine. And it would be hugely laborious to do that in terms of time frame. What we did do though is take the descriptors of the food as provided by the home and based on our observation, and use that to categorize our individual residents into one of the IDDSI categories in terms of solids and then fluids. As you know, with fluids, we just said thickened fluid. We didn't try to attempt to do IDDSI 2 or 3. For diet type, you can see regular here and IDDSI 3 to 5, and protein intake and fiber intake and fluid intake across regardless of texture there. We didn't try to discriminate there. So energy intake in C is lower with a modified texture diet, as is the fiber intake, and the fluid is low in general for residents. Interestingly, the protein wasn't low, and this is because in Canada, again, there's been lots of advances around enhancing food products to try to promote protein in the diet, enhancing specifically pureed and minced products. If we look though at more detail at the menu, or at the food that was consumed, and use the DRI, which is the dietary reference intake, looking for nutrients where more than 50% of the sample were not meeting the recommendation for the DRI. We found many nutrients were not consumed at a level that would be for health, and you can see them on this slide here. Where we found modified texture food to be less than regular, so even worse consumption, was folate, iron, selenium, sodium, B1, B2, myosin, folate, K, iron, selenium, and sodium. But where modified texture foods actually were better than the regular texture was vitamin C, D, calcium, zinc, and for women, vitamin C alone. So M meant male here, and female was F. You might say, why is that? Again, vitamin D and calcium, because we're often fortifying with some sort of milk product in the minced diet in some shape or form, or pureed diet. And vitamin C, because again, in Ontario as a leader, but also in other provinces, when they puree the food, they actually, as you know, it makes a smaller portion than the regular portion, and they would actually puree it to be the same portion size, finished portion size as the regular. So thinking about fruits and vegetables, for example, when they puree down, they would actually have to have a larger portion to begin with than the regular to make the same portion at the end point. So is modified texture food associated with malnutrition? So that's the big question, right? Recognizing that these individuals had eating challenges, they often required eating assistance, they were had cognitive impairment, obviously challenges perhaps in eating beyond requiring eating assistance, and oral health. And so we decided to do a regression analysis using the mini nutrition assessment short form as the outcome variable, and using that as a score and not as cut points to identify if minced and moist or pureed food were associated compared to the regular texture consumers with being malnourished. And what you can see here is that yes, that is the case. Minced and moist was associated with being malnourished in a negative way, as was pureed food. And so age was also important, oral nutrition supplements, as well as cognitive impairment and eating challenge, as well as oral health. But what this says to us is that when someone's on a minced and moist diet specifically, this is leading to potential malnutrition in the older adult. And I just realized now I forgot a star on the pureed. There should be a star there as well. So please excuse that. It's also pureed food. So the diet itself, so something about the food and its adequacy is affecting the food intake of individuals and leading to malnutrition. So we know from prior research that dysphagia and dehydration is also common. Unfortunately, in our data set, we haven't looked at this point yet around thickened fluids. We do have a speech pathology PhD student who's looking at some of this now, but I don't have that data available. But essentially, we know that when someone is on thickened fluids, they're less likely to drink an adequate amount, depending on how that's measured, of course, in various studies. So what is associated with food intake in the M3 sample? So now let's looking at everybody in the study, not just modified compared to regular texture. And this was the main analysis that we designed the study to address. And you can see here some of the key important factors that are identified in this analysis. And sorry, I forgot to put the stars here, but I can tell you which ones were important. So the person having eating challenges was significant, as well as nutrition risk, obviously. Or I guess NS means those ones that were not significant. Everything else was significant in this table, so that should help you there. Persons that were malnourished, obviously eating less food. In terms of eating assistance, those who required some eating assistance ate less. Those who required often eating assistance or getting total eating assistance ate more. And that makes sense when you think about it. Again, in Canada, we have most provinces follow legislation of having one-on-one eating assistance or 1 to 2 at maximum, which means when you have a guaranteed support for eating at meals, you're going to eat more versus someone who's struggling perhaps to be eating their own meal, and only at the end of the meal when it's being noted that they're not eating well might team members step in and try to provide a bit of support. Person-centeredness was associated with more energy intake. Being in a dementia care area also associated with better energy and protein intake. So something about that specialized environment, whether it be a smaller environment or specialized staff, was important. But I want to identify here the pureed and liquidized diet, although non-significant on its own, was when we put it with eating challenges, you can see that it did impact food intake. And when people had a significant eating challenge but were on a pureed diet, they ate more, which shows the importance again of someone being supported to eat when they're on a modified texture food diet. So what impacts modified texture foods in long-term care? Well, a lot of things, unfortunately. And so beyond the M3 concept, this work was actually done outside, some of it outside of the M3 study, earlier work that I'd done around pureed and food production in long-term care. So there's insufficient food funding. If it varies by province, obviously, some have policies that promote quality as well around pureed food, but others do not, or modified texture foods. As well, the skill and capacity for homes to make modified texture food, or any food, quite frankly, and plan the menu varies. So when we did the analysis by menus, there was definitely province differences, but also within provinces, those 8 homes were different, which suggested to us that people in the home might have a greater affinity for making modified texture foods or using standardized recipes, or have better skill at menu planning. So this is something that needs to be built up in terms of our development. The facility environment could be a barrier. Many homes don't have sufficient footprint in their kitchens for doing a variety of tasks to do from scratch cooking. They might not have sufficient frozen storage. This can impact obviously then some of the food that's available to them. We found in the M3 study that for-profit homes actually provided more energy on their menu and protein than non-for-profit homes. So it's not necessarily a for-profit issue that is leading to poor food quality in long-term care. The frequency of the menu revision, though, says something about, again, the importance that is put towards this task. And so a home that was revising the menu twice a year would suggest they really prioritize that activity versus a home that only did it every 18 months or so. There's obviously policy constraints in every province around making food, and there might be the requirement to match the regular texture to the modified texture, which means there's limits then. You can imagine some products do not when you try to modify their texture, they don't do well. String beans, some things get very watery. And this means then you have to add thickener in to try to stop that or improve it in some shape or form, rather than finding just a better product that purees well. So that's key, that there's this requirement to match the food. And then finally, purchasing commercial food is impacted by the concerns about putting food quality and making in-house products. Families and residents want home-cooked food, as do often legislation and the provinces overseeing this. And so there's a real push to provide in-home food, but the hours aren't necessarily there for staff to make good quality scratch food, including modified texture foods. The philosophy of the food production could also be important, like how important they see modified texture foods, and it's a way to enhance the quality of life of individuals versus more being around being really safe and being risk averse. So that philosophy that they have. The number of residents requiring modified textures. So if you have only 1 or 2 people requiring thickened fluids, then making thickened fluids is going to be a real challenge in the kitchen for you. This is why we often see then team members making the thickened fluid at the table side, which isn't a best practice unless they've been very well trained. Or buying commercial. But again, the expense, if they don't have enough money in their food budget for buying those specialized products, this is a challenge. Staffing capacity and environment, again, for a consistent product. Chef to chef, there could be differences, or person to person. It may not even be the chef that's making the modified texture food. Even if there are standardized recipes, are they using them? We all know that even when you have a recipe, different techniques that people may use can impact the quality, and why the importance of using IDDSI to standardize the product. What do consumers actually think of this food? And so when we actually had the good fortune to talk to 15 people who actually consumed pureed food, and it took us going to 5 different institutions to find folks, and I say institutions because some of it was chronic care hospitals where people had been on pureed food because of their health condition, but they didn't have dementia and they could speak to us. Whereas in long-term care, many of the folks that are on pureed food have a significant cognitive impairment. But just take a moment to read some of these comments and quotes from these folks. So obviously consumers don't like modified texture food, and thickened fluids too. We didn't specifically talk about that, but I'm sure you're aware of residents just saying, you know, I'm in my 90s, all I want is my coffee, regular coffee. I don't want it thickened. The thickening takes away the taste for individuals and their quality of life as a result. So how can we improve modified texture foods? Well, as I said, using the IDDSI to standardize is a key first step for homes to make sure that they're on track. Presentation in terms of sauces to really support knowing what the food is. You can imagine if you've got a beige meat, you don't know if it's pork, you don't know if it's chicken, you don't know if it's turkey. If there's cranberry sauce on it, it might suggest now that it might be turkey for you. Sensory appeal is really important to people. When we ask residents again, or folks who consume pureed food, what's the most important thing to you? Taste was it. They get over the look. Look is certainly important, especially when they're first introduced to pureed food, but it has to taste good. And we know that folks think when it's got enhancement of thickeners being used, it changes the taste profile. Molding the food in some shape or form. It doesn't have to look like the exact food. It just has to look nice. So putting it into a shape that looks like something other than quite frankly, something that's moving slowly on a plate. I don't want to use a word that's not very positive, but piping food. I've played around with a team around 3D printing. We're not nearly there yet, but that could be something in the future. We need to make sure this food is nutrient dense. When you saw the other factors influencing the food intake of these folks, they have cognitive impairment, they have eating challenges, they have oral health problems. We have to make sure that every bite counts because they may not eat a full plate of food. We need to enhance the food where we can to make it look better as well as taste better and promote that nutrient density, and perhaps even think about fortification of the food in some cases. But that leads to more of a commercial production, as you can imagine, to ensure that the fortificants are at the right level. So there has been a little bit of research that if we do some of these things, it does lead to better food intake. So this is a study looking at standardizing texture, a 12-week randomized controlled study in 20 individuals. They standardized portion size, the use of the thickener, so the amount, so it didn't get too thick or the taste profile wasn't as impacted, and controlled the viscosity. This compared traditional diet, they found increased energy and protein intake, and the persons gained weight as well as hand grip strength, which is a marker of potentially sarcopenia. In terms of improving the sensory appeal and nutrient density, studies have been done that shows that micronutrient fortification of pureed food can lead to increased serum levels of nutrients. That was a study done in Saskatchewan by Canadian colleagues. Molding and enhancing the food with key ingredients like canola oil and whey protein can increase the protein content and promote weight gain of the individual. Reshaping foods, this was again another Canadian study done in Quebec by Germain et al., where if they reshape the food into a looking very similar to the original product, you can promote body weight. And then using excessive thickener to mold the food was not perceived positively. So there's a real tension between reshaping and using thickeners to do that, and also at the same time not using excessive products to change the taste profile as well as the mouthfeel for the residents. So Nutrition Disguise is a project that I've been involved with since 2018. And here we've been trying to think about how can we enhance food products for the entire resident population in long-term care, including those on modified texture food diets. This is an open access publication, but the concept is taking things like black beans and sweet potato and putting them into foods that you would not typically see them, chocolate pudding. And can it be seen as a way to enhance nutrition and still reflect the desires and preferences of those residents? You can find our recipes on Cisco as well as on the RA website, and this was funded by Weston Seeding Food Innovation. To further promote intake, we should have continuity of staff providing care. So even if the food and the thickened fluids are made in the kitchen, at the plate point, or even at the plating point, different staff will do different things with products. For example, I'm sure you've all seen this, where staff may add gravy to something to try to thin it out, or try to make it smoother for an individual. And this is because it often sits too long, it gets a crust on it perhaps, but people do things to the food in a way that then changes the taste profile and its appearance, and not necessarily in a good way. We need to work together. This is a whole team effort. We can't have dietary and nursing be on separate teams. And we need to have speech paths and dietitians working together and not in silos around this issue. We can't have one person saying, here, let's do this texture modification, and then the group over here trying to say, well, that's going to be really hard to do. They have to come together and try to meet the needs of the resident first. We have to think about the physical environment as well, because often these folks require eating assistance or have challenges eating, and that can lead to challenges then potentially with choking. So we need to make sure physical environment is conducive to eating and supportive, and very well-trained staff to support them. A very social eating environment. Now you might say, how does that contrary to being safe? Agreed. Perhaps we socialize before the meal for persons who require eating assistance in some shape or form, but then focus in on really providing high quality eating assistance, but still what we call relation-centered care. So not treating the person as a task, but as an individual who's requiring that eating assistance. Provide culturally familiar food that is palatable. That's key. Even within modified texture foods, that's a requirement. We have to do that because people will not eat what they do not like. We need to have flexible meal times when people are ready to eat, especially when they have eating challenges. Staff education around nutrition, hydration, as well as frequency of offering food products between meals, because not everyone will eat well enough at a meal to meet the nutritional needs. And available thickened fluids between meals. This is the group that's most prone to dehydration in long-term care. We will give them thickened fluids at meals and make sure they get stocked up on those thickened fluids, maybe to the detriment of their food intake. But between meals, because we require often eating assistance, that seems to be absent in many homes, unfortunately. Either the thickened fluid's not available or the staff are not taking the time to provide that eating assistance for the person. I'd like to make an appeal in my second last slide here for the resident. I think I can remember in my career perhaps being too aggressive with modified texture foods and fluids. And we have to remember that this is the person and their quality of life is paramount. And so we have to be able to live with some level of risk and supporting the individual to eat what they want to eat. So that anecdote about someone in their 90s, they are able to handle all other thickened foods, but they want their coffee as coffee. We've got to be able to figure out how to do that to meet the quality needs of that quality of life needs of that individual. So we have to balance safety and of swallowing and quality of life, and this needs to be done better. Weigh the risks and the benefits with the family and the resident. Perhaps think about a sliding scale around dysphagia and its risks for the individual. Perhaps in the morning they do quite well with thin textures or regular textures, but by the end of the day when they're tired, that's when a thickened fluid is needed to support them in terms of preventing aspiration. Think about individualization as well of management strategies. This is a real issue in long-term care across the board, whatever the issue may be, is a lack of individualization. And we see this obviously, again, with modified texture foods and fluids. We just do the common texture for everybody, making it as simple as possible for staff and efficient, but that means then that we're over thickening, over pureeing the product and giving the safest texture to people rather than the safest for that individual. We suggest a trial of various strategies for individuals rather than just going again with blanket strategies, trying to treat people as individuals, and reassess. How many times have we seen someone put on thickened fluid or a pureed texture after they come back from hospital, they've had a stroke, and we don't think about reassessing it, and they might have the capacity to handle some other food products. So in conclusion, residents with dysphagia are vulnerable to poor food and fluid intake, malnutrition, and dehydration. Modified texture diet itself is predictive of malnutrition, so we need to do better with not only assessing and prescribing modified texture foods, but also thinking about the diet, the foods and fluids that we're making to make sure that they are meeting the needs of individuals. We need to think about processes to support individuals that are on thickened fluids between meals so that they are at less risk for dehydration. We need to be more judicious, I think, in our use of modified texture foods in some cases and consider the risks of using this because of the challenges around malnutrition. Improving modified texture food products is definitely necessary. We need practical and feasible improvements, and this is where the Nutrition Disguise project is trying to work through. People need recipes that they can stand by, and so trying to work through those recipes and making large quantities and showing that they still hold up. We need to standardize, improve sensory appeal, and enhance the modified texture food with nutrients. We need recipes for molded and enhanced modified texture foods. We need commercially prepared foods that are inexpensive enough to meet the needs of the home in terms of the price point. They have to provide a nutritional advantage as well. We can't just have thickened fluids that are just thickened fluids. They actually should have a nutrient benefit beyond the base fluid that's there. And then residents' choice and quality of life are paramount. With that, I'll just make some acknowledgements around the funding and team members that have been hugely important in the M3 study, and of course, all of the homes and residents who've been part of the research over the last decade or so of work that we've done. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Keller, for sharing your research with us. That was wonderful. We'll now move on to question and answer period. So if you have any questions, you can submit them using the questions tab in the GoToWebinar panel. And we just want to be respectful of everyone's time. So we'll try to stay focused on relevant questions for today's topic. And if you have general questions about the IDDSI framework, testing methods, you can always visit our website, IDDSI.org. That is IDDSI.org/resources, when you can find free resources and information. We have a few questions already, so why don't we get started? Okay, Jamie is asking, Dr. Keller, you had mentioned sauces. Are you using sauce and gravy on your puree? Our facility's kitchen is stating that those are not compliant with IDDSI. Any thoughts?
That's an interesting issue. Yeah, and this is where IDDSI runs up against some of the other, what I would consider better practices. So sauce is, of course, important with respect to providing color, providing a sense of interest in the food, and that's why we'd want to do it, and making it recognizable. So that was a recommendation that came out of that work, talking with people that made pureed food and provided pureed food to residents, but also people that consumed it. They thought a sauce would be very important in terms of making the food recognizable and tasty. So if taste is the paramount, we've got to figure out the IDDSI question. So I don't have an answer for that. That might be IDDSI. IDDSI might have to figure that out. So, you know, if we're providing a cheese sauce on the side of it, we've got to figure that out.
And is the answer the same for syrup as well? Because there was a follow-up from Jamie asking about syrup, and are you using or allowing them on all diets?
Yeah, and so syrup, I mean, depends on how much you're putting on, of course, on a product. Syrup's a bit thinner than typically most sauces, I would think. But yeah, similarly, you have to think about that. You know, we could also provide syrup on the side and food is dipped into it. If it's minced and moist, it might work that way, but pureed, probably not. And so we have to take that into account, that when a syrup is put on, how does that impact the texture? Absolutely.
Great. You know, we also have Peter Lamb on the call, who's the IDDSI co-chair. So I wonder if maybe we can also invite him to pitch in with this question about the sauces. Peter,
Yeah.
are you there?
Yes, thank you very much, Alan. Heather, thank you once again. Great webinar. With regards to the question around sauces and use of condiments, I think we have to be careful to say that, you know, IDDSI recommends that sauces and condiments are used in a certain way. The definition for textural levels and characteristics of food really should be determined by the testing methods that we've recommended. So I think we have to be careful about saying, you know, you have to combine a sauce with this particular food in this way, or you are allowed to have this sauce or not allowed to have this sauce. That's not what IDDSI was ever meant to do. IDDSI really is a description, not a prescription. And what we really challenge all clinicians to consider is how we actually do that assessment and how we determine what the person actually can or cannot manage based on their individual skills. So Heather, kudos to you for saying, you know, we need to do more individualization. We need to look at how to meet, you know, the needs and the abilities of the person who's eating that meal. And rather than slapping on, you know, what we've traditionally done, which is a textural level, okay, to a person and saying they're confined to this forever and ever, maybe we do need to look at their abilities and how it varies through the day and have that sliding scale. So that's what IDDSI actually allows us to do, because we're now looking at consistency and description of textural characteristics, you know, ability to determine appropriate thickness of liquids rather than doing estimations, and then be able to use IDDSI to be able to better our clinical evaluation techniques. So I'm going to zip up here, Heather, back to you.
Great. Yeah, I like that you emphasize the individualization, and that's the challenge we've got, right? With the way long-term care now is, whatever it is, bathing, eating, dressing, none of it's as individualized as it really needs to be, quite frankly, to provide quality of life.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Dr. Keller. We'll move on. Mary is asking, how receptive were the facilities with making these changes, with ideas that maybe came up? Were there ideas that maybe came up that would help, and with transitioning to IDDSI?
Right, and so I haven't done any interventions around this. These are just the recommendations that we've made from the variety of work that we've done over the years around adding sauces to food, etc. So that hasn't been done for sure. That's a key area. The challenge of getting this work done is getting research funding for food is not easy, right, as we all know. And that's why the NID project actually is funded by CLRI, which is through the government of Ontario. It's sort of a way to try to promote team learning around best practices in long-term care, but research funding around food, can't get it. So I'd love to do a study like that to see how homes can adapt some of these recommendations to provide better quality food. It's just not there. And so it tends to be anecdotally what people are doing, we hear about, and what they are challenged with, and then trying to adapt from there.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Chloe asking, do you have any comments on MTF and ethical issues for the client or resident and for the clinician?
Absolutely. That's sort of why I put that one slide in there, remembering the resident. This is our first concern. I think we often get too excited about, we see, and I worked as a clinician for a long time in a chronic care hospital. I can say we got too excited about someone coughing when they're eating and put them on something that might have been overly aggressive, and without seeing some of the sequelae that you would expect to see, such as aspiration pneumonia. I'll give you a personal story. My husband actually lives with Bell's palsy. He's been coughing while he eats for 7 years and never had aspiration pneumonia. I'm sure if we were to do a swallowing assessment, a standardized swallowing assessment, we'd say he needs something thickened. You know, that would be overly aggressive, right? And so we have to use our judgment a little bit more and think about using our instrumental assessments where we can to really justify, I think, moving towards thickened fluid. And then recognizing again, the resident, if they know the risks and they're willing to take them, then we need to abide by that. It is their choice.
Great. Heidi is asking, do you have many vegan requests at your location, and what protein options have you offered to these residents?
Yeah, vegan is becoming more and more common, of course, in long-term care. And so I don't work in a specific home. I'm a researcher, but I am affiliated with Schlegel Villages, which does have 19 homes, I believe, in Southwestern Ontario. And more vegan is becoming common. That's a real challenge for menu planning. Absolutely. And then add on to the modified texture piece. So we have to move towards thinking about products that might be available that can be a substitute for meat that would meeting that texture. And you certainly can buy products that I'm a flexitarian myself. You can buy some soy-based products that actually would fit the minced and moist quite nicely. Pureed is the challenge, I think, and so moving towards pureed lentils, pureed tofu, those and recipes that include those products is key. That's where we have to go, unfortunately. The challenge is long-term care chefs aren't used to using these products, right? They've been trained on menus that are not vegetarian typically, and they may not have ever cooked with tofu. And so part of our Nutrition Disguise project, we actually had one of our years of, we actually go to colleges that are training chefs to work in various settings, not just in long-term care. And we ask them to enhance the food products with plant-based proteins, preferably. They would get more marks on the review when they try to do that. So we're trying to push that agenda and trying to develop recipes, but it's not easy. But those would be the two key ingredients that we'd have to look towards. Legumes, lentils puree extremely well. Also, some of the whole grains do well, but they're not, of course, as good a choice as lentils and legumes would be, and as well as soy.
Great, thank you. I relate to that as a flexitarian myself. Elizabeth is asking, I have found that residents in level 5 and 6 end up declining the diet altogether when they realize traditionally prepared bread or toast will not pass the test? Do you have
Yeah.
any feedback regarding bread, other than making it minced and moist, that has worked for LTC communities?
Yeah, I haven't seen it, and this is a huge problem. Older adults like to have a bread or bun, or even thinking about some of the additions to some of their foods, right, that might have had something consistent with that. Pancake, right, in the morning. So those would be challenges for them for sure. I haven't heard of any long-term care home yet succeeding around the side of bread. I did have a chef working a little bit on that. He came up with a recipe that might work, but it's quite frankly, it's very labor intensive. And that's the challenge we have before us. And I haven't done any taste testing around that to see if it's going to be accepted.
Thank you. Mary's asking, often when doing IDDSI testing on sauces and gravies, I find that they can easily make them level 3 and tasty for all. And they tend at this level to complement the look and taste and don't run out. So
Exactly. And that speaks to a point about making modified textures normative, right? Or thickened fluids, for example. So can we make something that's thickened that everybody in the home would want to drink? Okay.
Great. Question from Mike. Shouldn't the gravy or sauce match the resident's prescribed liquid consistency?
I
would suggest that's a question for Peter.
Sure, Heather, I'm jumping back in here. Again, this really depends on the person's abilities. And this is where I think as clinicians who do the assessments, we really do challenge people to start looking at your assessment process in a very different light than perhaps you've done before. And Heather, you talked about collaboration and working as a team. And we really want to emphasize the importance of doing this, even as you're transitioning towards the use of IDDSI terminology. And keep in mind, the primary purpose of transitioning to IDDSI terminology is so that we have consistency in terminology that improves the safety for the residents that we're supporting. So IDDSI is not meant to be restrictive. It's actually meant to provide more flexibility. What's really limited us, particularly I think in North America, in the way that we've practiced the use of texture modified foods and the service of texture modified foods, is our flexibility. We say, hey, if you're on a mince texture diet, taking the old NED or mechanically altered type diet, then the expectation is that every single thing needs to be minced, right? Or every single thing needs to be pureed. So what we're really challenging clinicians to do is actually look at the food characteristics of the individual components of the meal and say, yeah, can this individual, Heather, take your famous example of coffee, manage coffee? Because sipping something may elicit a very different ability than gulping or drinking something quickly. So this is something that is at the clinician's discretion. And Heather, I fully agree with you that, in many circumstances, people may be overprescribed a modified texture food. And maybe we do need to look at it with a different lens and not overreact and immediately put somebody onto something that's overly texture modified that drives them towards, taking less food and putting them at risk for malnutrition. We have heard success stories, which is, hey, now that we've got different texture availability, those who have never made a minced and moist texture or soft and bite-sized texture, and they're now able to be provided with these additional texture characteristics. We are seeing some preliminary data coming out that gives us very promising, goals to aim for, which is it's increasing their intake. And I'm so with you, Heather, when we say normalize the diet as much as possible. Normalize the food and drink that you serve to people as much as possible. And we understand that there are going to be some challenges as you transition from your current terminology to IDDSI. I think I want to just quickly address that issue of bread. The understanding or the perception right now is if somebody is determined to be safest with minced and moist or with pureed foods, then I think our question is, well, can the bread product or the starch product be provided in a way where it doesn't present the risk that is commonly associated with the bread and the starch foods, and that's choking. So that's the question, and that's the challenge that we present to the clinician community, the food service community, the support staff. We're often so sad to hear people say to us, well, we've been serving bread for years and nobody's choked and died yet. Okay, well, how many deaths does it need to take for us to actually recognize that that is a potential risk? And that's the question that I would ask the audience.
Thank you, Peter. Okay, we are almost at time, so I'm going to do one last question and then we'll wrap it up if that's okay with everybody. Dolores is asking, can you speak to transition or mixed consistency foods such as ice cream as a favorite for most in long-term care, and what can be done to allow them on the IDDSI? They're calling IDDSI diet, but I know that IDDSI is not a diet, but that's the question.
I think we've sort of addressed that a bit already with the idea of individualization, right? And so if there's a favorite food that someone wants to eat, we have to figure out how we can support that person to consume it in a way that's going to be appropriate. And also think about where they are in their trajectory. We often see dysphagia, and actually I have a student doing looking at end of life, and she's looked at, can't remember the exact number, but it's over 160 people who died in 16 homes randomly selected, and looked at what happened to them in the 6 months prior to life. Dysphagia is rampant at the end of life. Why are we putting someone on thickened fluid at the end of life? Right? Give them the ice cream that they want. And that we need to figure out, we need to understand trajectory, we need to understand individualization, and we need to think about some of these more challenging foods that change texture in the mouth. How are we going to address that? A teaspoon versus a small amount. There's different ways and strategies that can do this. No one wants to choke, and they always will do a protective behavior typically if they're choking. It's the silent aspiration, of course, that is a challenge for us. But people are silently aspirating their saliva every day if they've got aspiration. So let's think about this, about what's really, really needed in terms of quality of life for people.
Well, that was wonderful. Thank you. I think we're going to end it there because we're nearing the top of the hour. So if we didn't get to your question, do keep an eye out on future eBites where we will try to address these questions. And you can sign up for the monthly eBite directly on our website, IDDSI.org. And that marks the end of this webinar. And before we go, just a quick reminder that a recording will be available through our YouTube channel at the end of the week. And you will be receiving a certificate of attendance as soon as we are done. And if you know anyone who would benefit from listening to the recording of the session, please do share it with them once it is available. Thank you so much, Dr. Keller, for your very informative, for sharing your research with us this morning and for making time for us today. And thank you, the listeners, for joining us today. We hope that you found this information useful in your practice and wherever you are with IDDSI implementation. We are signing off. Have a great rest of your week. And until next time, thank you very much.
Thank you, Heather. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.